Hi again, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the next article that I asked you to read on animals, and that is an article by R.G. Frey, and it's titled Moral Standing, the Value of Lives and Speciesism. All right. R.G. Frey. Um, R.G. Frey, Moral Standing, the Value of Lives and Speciesism. Okay, so here's an outline of the topics that I want to cover. I'm basically going to follow the Roman numeral numbering that he uses to organize his own article, but I have given his Roman numerals titles so that we can have a better sense of what he talks about in each one. So Roman numeral 1 will be what I call the unequal value thesis, something he talks about. Okay. Roman numeral 2, defending unequal value. Okay. Roman numeral 3, I would call autonomy and agency. And we're going to skip this section, actually. It's not going to be that relevant for us. Number 4, against speciesism. Number 5, the argument from marginal cases. It can be a little bit more informative. Let's call this against the argument from marginal cases because he's going to criticize it. Number 6, why not speciesism? And then number 7, indirect speciesism. Okay. And I guess I could be even make this bigger so that the font is bigger. I can even make section number 7 also a little bit more informative. He's going to be against indirect speciesism too. Okay, so unequal value thesis. So Frey, he says, look, almost everybody in the world believes that the following theses. Almost everyone believes the following claims or theses. 1, animal life has some value. It's not totally worthless. We need to take account of whether animals live or die, at least somewhat, when we are deciding what to do. Okay? Number 2, not all animal life has the same value. So the example he gives is most people think that dogs, cats, chimps are more important than mice, rats, worms. Okay, so not all animal life has the same value. And then number 3, this is the one that's the unequal value thesis. Unequal value thesis. Okay, that in particular, if you take a specific version of this second principle and apply it to humans, he says, look, almost everybody believes that human life is more valuable than animal life. Okay? He gives an example of this. He calls this kind of I think he calls it like the classic example. Okay? It's this hypothetical scenario where you're trapped on a life raft and there's too many creatures on board. If everyone stays on board, the whole raft will sink and everybody will drown. Okay? And so one creature on the raft is a human. Throw the human overboard, okay, or the dog. And that's the other creature, all right? So the question is, there are these 2 extra creatures on the life raft. If you keep everybody on board, you're all going to drown. Which one do you throw over? Okay, so he says everybody will say, you know, you're crazy if you throw the human overboard. You got to throw the dog overboard, okay? And that shows, according to him, that this unequal value thesis is true. All right. Now, Frey's position is a little bit more nuanced than that. He's written about animals and, you know, kind of the ethics of how we ought to treat animals for a long time, for several decades. This is like his main area of research. And he says he wants to distinguish between pain and life, okay? He also calls, you know, pain, and I'm not going to really distinguish this, but pain and suffering. Pain or suffering, and maybe I'll put it this way to make the contrast more clear, versus life. Okay? He says, when the issue is pain and suffering, we tend to think of humans and animals in the same way. Okay? Because both can feel pain and suffer. Suffering is sometimes a more broad concept. It's something, like sadness is a form of suffering. And animals can be sad. Like, dogs can be sad when their friends die. Elephants can be sad. I heard a story about an elephant whose little baby calf died, and she carried it around for days after it had died. That seems to be evidence that, the mom was sad. Okay. But Frey's point here is that if the issue is pain and suffering, if we're talking about inflicting pain and suffering on animals versus on humans, we tend to think inflicting pain and suffering on both humans and animals is wrong for the same reason. They can both feel pain and suffer. Okay? But, and this is a key point, or a key point that Frey is going to come back to again and again in this article, he says, life is different though. Okay? He wants to say, human life is more valuable than animal life. Okay? And why is that? Why is it according to Frey that human life is more valuable than animal life? Well, it's because humans have autonomy and agency, okay, which animals lack. Okay? So I'll just briefly go over, I'm going to kind of skip this. We're not going to talk in too much detail about this. Autonomy and agency. Autonomy is basically being able to make choices rationally, okay, or deliberatively. Like you think about something, you weigh the pros and the cons, and then you choose, okay? Agency is kind of the more basic thing, just kind of being able to choose, okay? Being able to say, you know what, I want this rather than I want that. Okay, so Frey says, and he doesn't really defend it in this article, although he has defended this view in print in other areas, in other places. He says, humans have autonomy and agency, animals don't. Or if they do, it's to a much more restricted degree than humans do. And this is what makes, he thinks, human life more valuable than animal life. Okay, so we'll come back to that. He also says, interestingly here, he only kind of teases at this, and he doesn't really follow up on it. He says, but this difference between pain and suffering versus life, that if the idea is should we be allowed to inflict pain and suffering on animals? Well, no, because they, unless the benefit is really great, because, they feel pain, they suffer, and that's bad. But if we're talking about the value of life, then animals have a much lower value. Their lives are much less valuable than ours are. Okay. But he uses this idea to suggest, and again, he doesn't follow up, but he uses this idea to suggest maybe we can use this distinction to justify inflicting pain and suffering on animals in order to help save human lives. In other words, via medical research, using animals like rabbits or mice or something, okay? And that's because again, human lives are so valuable. Human lives are so valuable, okay? And maybe we wouldn't be allowed to do that if the goal was just to save animal lives, because their lives are not as valuable. Okay, so the next point that Frey wants to make, or the next topic he wants to discuss, is how to defend this unequal value thesis. Okay, so that's going to be our next slide in the next section of his article, defending unequal value. Maybe I'll put the Roman numeral here, Roman numeral 2. Defending unequal value, and this one I'll put Roman numeral 1. Sorry, I went back a couple of slides. Unequal value thesis, now I'm going to go to this one, defending unequal value. Okay, so remember, the unequal value thesis is as follows. The unequal value thesis is as follows. Human life is more valuable than animal life. Okay? So how can we defend that? Why should this be? Well, one possibility is what Frey calls speciesism. And different people use this word in different ways. It's supposed to be analogous to racism and sexism. Okay, here's the way Frey is using this word. Okay, a speciesist is someone who thinks it's just a brute fact that admits of no further explanation or justification that human life is more valuable than animal life. Just get over it. There's nothing else to say about it. Just human life is more valuable than animal life, period. No other thing you can say to defend that. It's just a brute fact. Okay? That's speciesism. So R.G. Frey is not a speciesism, not a speciesist. Speciesism is wrong. Okay? He thinks the reason that human life is more valuable than animal life is that it is much higher, I should be specific about what it refers to. Human life is much higher in quality than animal life. Okay? And value is a function of quality. The value of that life is a function of the quality of that life. Okay? So he wants to explain this a little bit more. He says there are entire dimensions to human life that animals simply lack. Okay? Love, marriage, educating kids, jobs, hobbies, sporting events, cultural pursuits, intellectual development, and striving, he says. This is pretty much a direct quote of the things he says, etc. Okay? He even says, look, when we, at the end of our lives, when we look back and have fond memories of the things we've done and wish that we could have done certain things more, the things we have fond memories of, the things we wish we could do more of, are never the things that animals could also do. They are always these things that have the other dimensions of our lives. Okay? When we look back with, fondness or regret, it's always for these things, not the things that we share with animals. We never say, for example, oh man, I wish I'd gotten more massages. Massages feel good. You get a pleasurable feeling sensation. Or I wish I had had more sex, or something like that. No, we say things like, oh, I wish I had more kids, or my marriage had lasted, or etc., etc., etc. Okay? All right. Further, he says, we, unlike animals, can choose different conceptions of a good life. For example, artist versus educator versus mechanic. Okay? And he says everyone makes this kind of choice. You don't have to be like an intellectual and to think really hard and deliberate and so on. But he says, look, everybody makes this kind of choice to whether they, what kind of person they want to be, what they want to be when they grow up. And so he says, look, animals simply don't do this, but people do. People can do this. Okay, so as I said, we're going to skip section 3. That was autonomy and agency, because he's kind of there responding to an author that we have not read, Tom Regan, who also writes interesting stuff on animals, but it's, that's kind of insider baseball, so to speak, or insider philosophy. He's responding to a very specific and narrow criticism from Tom Regan. So we're going to skip that and move on to section 4, okay? Against speciesism, okay? So now he's going to explain why he's against speciesism. So remember, speciesism is the idea that it's just a brute fact that, one which we cannot justify any further, that human life is more valuable than animal life, okay? So think along similar lines, analogously, racism, on using these words in the same way, would be the view that it's just a brute fact that one race is better or more valuable than the other. And similarly for sexism and other kinds of isms you want to create. Okay, just a brute fact, cannot explain it any further. One race is just better or more valuable than the other. Okay. All right. The problem is, he says, speciesism has a hard time with marginal cases, okay, which is a concept that we were introduced to last time when we talked about Norcross's article. Okay, so remember, marginal cases are things like, severe Alzheimer's disease, someone with severe Alzheimer's disease, an infant born without a brain. So this is, if you want to Google some gross images, you can Google anencephaly. So Google this, look at the images, and then come back after you're sufficiently grossed out, and you can continue this lecture. So these are infants who are born without their cortex, without the upper part of their brain, and so when, just from birth, or not even from birth, from the time that they have this defect, it actually happens quite early on in gestation. Their neural tube fails to close properly just a few weeks into gestation. They basically have no brain, so they come out essentially like just vegetables, and they can live a few years like that, but they never have anything like the life that you and I have because they have no brain. Okay, so what should we think about these kinds of cases, or these kinds of people? Okay, Frey says, R.G. Frey says, we have to admit that some human life has much lower quality and therefore value than other human life. Okay, we have to. Like severe Alzheimer's. So we're not going to talk about Alzheimer's in this class. In my other class, I typically do. But in the late stage Alzheimer's, these people, they stop even interacting with the outside world. They don't make eye contact. They don't respond to like you talking to them. It's not that they just forget your name or something, or forget the birthdays of their children or whatever. It's much worse than that. They stop talking, they stop feeling hunger. They basically just sit there. You can continue to feed them if you put a tube into their stomach. You don't want to feed them through their mouth because then they'll choke. All right, so these people with severe Alzheimer's, their quality of life is essentially zero. They, like this infant born without a brain, they're like close to vegetables. They are biologically alive, but their brain is completely gone. Okay, so Frey says we have to admit that this kind of human life has much lower quality and therefore much lower value than other human life. All right? Okay, so here's a challenge, though, for Frey. Maybe I'll put this on another slide because I think this is quite important. Okay, still part of Roman numeral 5. Here's a challenge, medical research. Okay, so the challenge says this. Why not, okay, if marginal case humans have lives of much lower value than ours, the value of healthy human adults, why not use them for medical research? Okay, and then some people, when they push this challenge, they even say, indeed, they will often be better subjects than non-human animals. Okay, because if we want to try, at least if the target is to cure people, human beings of like diseases, cancer or something, animal models are not as good, accurate as human models. Okay, so this is something you learn, and like if you do like medical research, you learn that like if you can get human subjects to test your cancer drug or whatever, those human subjects, the data you get is going to be much more valuable than if you have to do the same research on mice. If you have to inflict mice with the cancer and then give them the drug, there are all kinds of differences between mice and humans that may contaminate or invalidate your results. Okay, but if you could use human models, you would get much better results. Okay, so here's the challenge. Frey, if marginal case humans have lives of much lower value, why not use them for medical research? Use these anencephalic infants. Use people with severe Alzheimer's for medical research. Okay. Do you remember what Frey says about this? If we were in class, I would pause and see if you remembered. But he basically says, right on, we should use marginal case humans in medical research? We should. He thinks this is exactly right. This is where the argument leads, and that's in fact what we should do. Okay? Or he says, he hesitates a little bit. He says, at the very least, if we're strongly against using marginal case humans, not cars, marginal case humans, we should be equally or more strongly against using animals in the same research. Okay? So Frey in general thinks, R.G. Frey in general, thinks or hopes that we can reduce the use of living subjects in research, like to the extent that we could use, for example, computer models to figure out what the best drugs are. We should do that instead of using any living creature at all, without their consent. But to the extent that we should be that we need to be using living creatures, at least sometimes using marginal case humans will be better. It'll give better medical results and be more ethical than using animals. Okay, so this is kind of potentially a shocking conclusion that he endorses. Okay, but there's also an argument from marginal cases that he wants to reject. And this is section 5. Against the argument from marginal cases. Okay, so consider this argument that many animal welfare advocates give. Okay, and this is my articulation of the argument is my own. It's not something that's in the article. Some of this article is again a little bit like insider baseball. He's kind of responding to other people in this literature, and he's assuming that they already know what this argument is. And but I'm explaining it to you because I'm not assuming that you know what it is. Okay, so here's the argument from marginal cases. It's one that Alistair Norcross gave in the last article that I asked you to read. If animals lack some moral significance because they lack properties XYZ, for example, e.g. rationality, autonomy, agency, then people who also lack XYZ also have no moral significance, or I'll say it this way, no moral value. I'll put it, if animals have no moral value because they lack properties XYZ, whatever you want to put in for XYZ, rationality, autonomy, agency, whatever it is, okay, then people who also lack that property would also have no moral value, okay? Second assumption, but people who lack XYZ still have moral value. This is one of the assumptions. Therefore, animals who lack XYZ also have moral value. In other words, properties XYZ are not what confer moral value. Okay? So again, the gist of the argument is, if you want to say, hey, the reason animals are morally trivial is because they're not smart, they're not rational, they don't have autonomy or agency, then people who also lack those traits, intelligence, autonomy, agency, would also have no moral value. But if you think about those people, premise number 2, those people, marginal cases, people with severe Alzheimer's, anencephalic infants, people in irreversible comas, they still have moral value, and therefore, so the argument goes, animals also have moral value too. All right, so that's the argument. Frey has a response to this, and I hope if you've been following along, you should be able to see what Frey's response is. Okay, if this were in class, I would pause and try to, glean it out of you. Can you tell what Frey's response to this is going to be? Okay, well, here it is. He thinks premise 2 is false. The argument is valid, okay, but he just thinks premise 2 is false. He says, look, that's the point he made in literally the point he made in the last section. He says, people who don't have autonomy and agency, they don't have moral value anymore. Their lives are not as high in quality as our lives, okay? And so the whole argument collapses, he says. Okay. Next section, Why not speciesism? Okay, so now he's imagining, people listening to him speak or reading his paper might be thinking, whoa, Frey, you're taking kind of a crazy position here. You're saying that we can do medical research on marginal case humans? You're saying that they have because they have no quality of life, there's no value to their life? Okay, why don't we back up and maybe just be speciesist? Why don't we just say it's a brute fact that anyone in the Homo sapiens species has moral significance? Okay, and so here in particular is a particular kind of challenge. So here's a challenge. Maybe speciesism giving higher value to our species as a brute fact is analogous to special relationships in other areas. Okay? For example, the relationship between parent and child. Okay? So suppose we were to ask, why is it okay for a parent to be not just a little bit preferential, but strongly preferential for her own child over any other child? Okay? Well, plausibly, this is just a brute fact. Like, there's nothing you can say. Like, you can't say, oh, my child is the smartest, even if all parents think that, right? You can't say, oh, my child is the best. My child is the most autonomous. No, none of those things apply. All you can say is, it's just a brute fact. It's my child, and there's nothing else that explains it. Period. Okay? So, why not say the same thing about speciesism? Okay, so Frey says the key difference between special relationships like the mother and child, and speciesism is that special relationships are typically voluntary. Okay, so mothers choose to have their children, okay, or other special relationships include like me being your teacher, okay, you being my student. Like, I should be strongly preferential for helping you learn material, but if there's some stranger on the street who also wants to learn about animals and social and moral issues, I have no obligation to teach this other person anything, okay? But I do have a very strong obligation to teach you these topics, and that's because I am in a special relationship with you. I am your teacher, you are my student, okay? But Frey says these special relationships are voluntary. We choose these, and we can often opt out of these whenever we feel like it, okay? And species membership is not like that, okay? It's typically voluntary. I can step in or out of these special relationships as I choose, okay? And species membership is not like that. Okay. Last topic then. Last unit, indirect speciesism. Or maybe I should say, I think I said earlier, against indirect speciesism. Okay, so indirect speciesism basically says R.G. Frey used biased human criteria to determine that animal life, like rabbits, this is one of the examples he uses, is of lower quality than human life. He used he used criteria where we excel, like autonomy, agency, being able to choose your life, love, marriage, hobbies, all that kind of stuff, right? And neglected criteria where rabbits might excel. For example, sense of smell. Rabbits can smell a lot. Their sense of smell is a lot more sensitive than ours is. So if we were to use a criterion like smelling delectable or good-smelling things, we would have very impoverished lives or potential lives relative to rabbits. Okay? If we used criteria like smelling wonderful smells, okay, then rabbits would have potential for much more valuable lives than we would, because our sense of smell is so blunted. Okay, so that's the objection against Frey. All right, so Frey's response, he says, the issue isn't about the intensity of pleasurable sensations. Rather, the point is that we humans have different dimensions to our lives that the other animals completely lack. Okay? It's not that, they have marriage, but it's just much more attenuated than our marriage. No, they don't have marriage at all, or hobbies, or this or that or the other, okay? So we have these completely other dimensions that rabbits and other animals lack, and even if our pleasurable sensations are not as, our sensory modalities are not as perceptive as theirs are, or not as sensitive as theirs are, doesn't matter, okay? All right, so that's Frey's article. One thing I wanted to mention when thinking about Frey's article versus Norcross is, to what extent do these two articles, are they compatible? Like, it could be that both Norcross and Frey are right. So it could, so Norcross, remember in the first article, was talking mostly about factory farming. And I'm not sure that what Frey says in his second article really confronts what Norcross argued about factory farming. So Frey could be against factory farming for the same reasons that Norcross is, that we're inflicting pain and suffering on these animals for the tiny increase in our, gustatory pleasure. All right, but I think still these are two interesting kind of different takes on the ethics of animals. And I hope you found this unit useful. Okay, thanks.